Good evening and welcome to the March 9th Muscatine Community School District Board of Education meeting. Madam Secretary, would you help start us off with roll call and determine a quorum, please?
My pleasure. Director Cooney?
Here.
DeBeat?
Here.
Draba?
Here.
Finn?
Here.
McCarter?
Here.
Morgan?
Here.
Sure.
Here.
A quorum is present.
Thank you. If you would all stand and join me in the pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to welcome all of our visitors and media representatives this evening. We appreciate you being here with us. Tonight, we start off on our agenda with a public hearing, which it covers the proposed plans, specification, proposed form of contract, and the estimated cost of said improvements for the Muscatine High School Fine Arts renovation project. Madam Secretary, would you do a roll call vote to open our public hearing?
Director Cooney?
Here.
DeBeat?
Aye.
Draba?
Aye.
Finn?
Aye.
McCarter?
Aye.
Morgan?
Yes.
Sure.
Aye.
All
And
ayes.
thank you, I apologize, I just did that in the wrong order. Would anyone like to motion that we open for the public hearing? I
that's-
should probably do that first.
So moved.
And second.
Second.
I'm going to assume we don't have any discussion about that. Can we make that official and roll call vote one more time
Bet.
to go into, open the public hearing?
You bet. Director Cooney?
Here. Sorry.
DeBeat?
Aye.
Draba?
Aye.
Finn?
Aye.
McCarter?
Aye.
Morgan?
Yes.
Sure.
Aye.
All ayes.
I'm so sorry. Thank you,
I
everyone.
didn't catch it either.
At this time, if we have anyone that would like to make any comments regarding the proposed plans, the specification, the spend, this would be the opportunity for the public to do this. A little bit later in our agenda, there will be an opportunity for the board to potentially vote on said item. I know that feels a little out of sequence. That's how the rules work. We start with the public hearing first. I don't see anyone in the audience moving. Madam Secretary, have we had any written or oral comments
I have
received?
received none.
Okay.
I move to close the public hearing.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to close the public hearing. Is there any other discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, I will let our Madam Secretary do our roll call vote again.
Director Cooney?
Here.
DeBeat?
Aye.
Draba?
Aye.
Finn?
Aye.
McCarter?
Aye.
Morgan?
Aye.
Sure.
Aye.
All ayes.
Thank you. The public hearing is now closed, and again, we'll come back. The board will revisit that topic in a little bit in further discussion. Next on our agenda is our student council update.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anaí Sinaceros, and this is Sydney Cox. We are part of Student Council, and we're going to be sharing some of the activities that Student Council has done this past couple of weeks. To start off, this month we had our Winter Thaw Dance. It was a success. We raised about $500, which was donated to Dance Marathon. Another successful senior survivor season came to close on Friday. We are happy to report that in all, senior survivors raised $8,358. Most of this was raised before senior survivor, but $632 was brought in from last week's community challenges. 5 teams entered into senior survivor week, and 4 were able to finish the whole competition. Here are the rankings for those 4 teams.
In fourth place, the yellow team, which was Natalie Lingle and Carson Harder, raised $897, which was all donated to the Muscatine Humane Society. In third place, the red team, which was Riley Blake and Cedric Castillo, raised $3,247 for the Living Land and Water Foundation. In second place, the blue team, which was Abby Folk and Tog Portilla, raised $2,220 for the Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital. And first place was the purple team, which was Morgan Pelton and Benson Storr. They raised $1,658 for the Muscatine Special Olympics. Student Council is thrilled and proud of our senior survivors and their dedication to serve their charities. They were very wonderful participants and worked very hard for the fundraising and during the actual week.
And to close, prom is set for April 18th from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. We will begin selling tickets right after returning from spring break up until April 3rd. Thank you.
Ladies, before you sneak away, does anyone have any questions for them? Your numbers always are amazing in what you do in your fundraising efforts. So your district is very proud of you in the amount that you all raised for Senior Survivor. That's amazing.
Thank
Thank you so much.
So thank you. Next on our agenda, I believe Becky Witchers is going to lead us through our employee recognition for the month.
Yes, thank you. Our March outstanding employees include Ashley DeVries. So Ashley, if you could come on up. Ashley was nominated by Courtney Goodwin. The passion and compassion that Ashley has for each and every single one of her students is so beautiful. When I say every single one, I mean not only her current students, but her former students. She goes above and beyond to make sure her students understand material and get extra services if needed. She is always checking in with former students to make sure that they are doing great or need any support. Ashley is great at communicating with parents to ensure that she understands her students' needs or just to send a positive report. She's not only amazing with students and parents, but is extremely supportive of her fellow coworkers and a great supporter to support staff as well. She's a joy to work with. Thank you, Ashley, for all the greatness you bring to McKinley. We are certainly blessed to have you. And Ashley is a 4th grade teacher at McKinley. Next, we have Tony Schmidt. Tony is a secretary at our Muskie Early Learning Center, and she was nominated by Mrs. Jessie Freers. Tony is a first-year building secretary, and in her just her 2nd year in the early childhood field. However, you would not know that based on her level of knowledge for both. She has taken the initiative to learn everything she can about being a building secretary and all of the grants, initiatives, and special knowledge related to early childhood. On top of that, children love Miss Tony, stopping and giving her hugs on her way in each morning. Our building would certainly not be as organized, welcoming, and happy if she wasn't at our front desk each day. Due to parent-teacher conferences, we have 3 individuals that couldn't be here, but I would still like to publicly acknowledge them as well. So next we have Miranda Dobson. Miranda is a 7th grade ELA teacher at Central Middle School, and she was nominated by Brenda Stewart. Miranda has been an exceptional grade-level team member. She is always willing to share ideas and resources to enlighten the load on others. Not only does she have an amazing wealth of knowledge for her content area, but she is also open to suggestions and flexible to try new things. She has made my transition from elementary school to middle school so much more manageable. Next, we have Ashley Steer, and Ashley is a building aide at Grant Elementary, and she was nominated by 1st grade teacher Dawn O'Connor. Miss Ashley is always seeking out new ways to assist students and teachers alike. She is kind, caring, friendly, and takes initiative. Our classroom is more fun with her in it, and each child is able to receive individual attention daily because of her presence. She has made me a better teacher, and I cannot imagine our room without her in it. And last we have Allison Warren, and Allison is a science teacher at Muscatine High School, and she was nominated by another science teacher, Allison Kaufman. Allison has a natural talent for connecting and engaging students in science. She finds ways to make learning hands-on and relatable, and students look forward to going to her chemistry and biology classes day in and day out. Her upbeat attitude and innovative ideas bring daily positivity to her PLC team and her colleagues. We are so lucky to have Allison as a member of the MCSD community. So thank you for sharing these wonderful March nominees.
Congratulations again to all of those. There's something very special about being acknowledged by your peers, so congratulations again. Next on our agenda is the Citizen Speaks portion of our agenda. This is where anyone that would like to address the board should feel free to step to the podium. We ask that you state your name and address for the record, and we also ask you keep your comments to 3 minutes and know that the board is not able to engage in conversation, but we're always happy to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm Daphne Donald, and I live here in Muscatine. Do we need to state our address?
Probably
Oh,
should for the
sorry.
record, yes,
Okay.
sorry.
I couldn't remember from last year. I live at 1559 Washington Street.
I'm Becky Easterhout. I live at 16219 H Avenue in Muscatine.
And I think you know why we're here. We've come a couple years. We like to talk about Race for the Schools. I gave you each a nice color copy, and then we have some purple copies too. There's a couple of things we want to remind everybody. This is our 8th year of doing Race for the Schools. It does benefit our wellness and PE programs at the school district. We've been able to each year keep the cost pretty low, because if you flip over the back of your flyer, you'll see that we have some really nice sponsors, businesses in town that give money so that we could keep the cost low. We also have scholarships available. This year, Becky's holding, we did actually last year too, we did a poster contest where we challenged the kids to create a poster. This year, we put it online and let everybody vote for it. So our art teachers, we owe them a big thank you. They promoted the contest and talked about it with the kids. This is this year's poster, and the top half you can see is created by the student, and he is a student at Madison School. His name's Mohit Wani. I think he's in 6th grade, right? And then the bottom half, James Hayes, our art teacher at the high school, helped put the logos on and our logo, and that I really appreciate that, because that was a lot of work for James. I kept calling him and saying, could you move this a little bit and change this a little bit? And so he was really nice about that. Like I said, the registration's open now. This year we have a website that Joanne Alderin, a person that used to be on our committee, that came back and said, hey, do you need any help? And I said, yes, we do. So she created a website, and Scott Comstock helped us too. So if you need any information at all, it's just muscatineracefortheschools.org. Everything is on there, the poster contest, the Muskie Challenge. We have a in-house challenge where each of the schools is challenged to have people register. If they volunteer or if they register for the race, they get credit for that. And Becky's actually organizing the volunteers this year, and every year. So,
And on the website, there's actually a place, if you're not into running or walking, but you'd like to help out with the race in any way, there's a link right there that you can sign up to be a volunteer. And volunteers also count as participation for the school challenge, so that's a good thing too.
we have a lot of fun things planned. The Key Club from the high school is coming. They're going to do face painting at the finish line. So, you know, if you do the 8 o'clock race, but you want to hang around a little bit, we'll have a bounce house. We have face painting. We'll have some opportunities for pictures. And then if you sign up, everybody that registers for the race gets a T-shirt, the T-shirts that we have on, and then all of the kids, this year we have a little experiment, if you bear with us for just 1 minute. This is just water, but
Promise we won't spill it.
this is called the Chameleon Cup that we're really excited about. The kids seem to really like it, but I'll show you why it's called a chameleon.
So the special thing about this cup is at the finish line, every student that crosses, whether they do the 1 mile, the Muskie Mile, or the 5K, gets this cup, and then they can take it over and fill it with some nice cold water, and it turns an awesome musky color. Now, I don't know what kid wouldn't want to get that across the finish line. And the straw, okay, here we
This is a
go.
bonus.
Mm,
Very
I
nice.
know. Okay, that's the main selling point for the race,
is.
right there.
When I
Does
showed
that
this-
magically turn into grape juice?
You
or-
know, when we showed this to some of the kids, they said, "Oh, the water turns purple." Well, actually, it's the cup, but they do love it, so we're excited about that. We do have the Muskie Challenge, and last year, actually 2 years ago, we realized some of our kids were doing the 1 mile and then turning around and running the 5K back to back. So last year, we started doing the Muskie Challenge, where if kids or adults run both races, they'll get a special finisher medal. So you do both races, you get a special medal. Otherwise, we have age group awards and the recognition for the school with the most. So is there anything else that we forgot? Oh, the other big thing this year is the bib, yeah.
Oh,
The
this is
bib
big.
timing,
Yeah.
this is big.
Almost bigger than the Coke.
Yeah, we have hired a company that will do electronic timing, so that as you come across the finish line within a few seconds, you can get a little printout of your timing, and I think people really like to have that. And it actually will be in your bib, so you don't have to turn your chip back in or anything. So yeah, we are excited about that.
Yeah, we are excited.
Yeah.
That's gonna make it nice.
So I think that's everything.
Any questions?
So any questions? If you know of anybody who wants to register, they can pick these up at any school. They can go to the website. We have a stack out here. Anything you need, let us know.
And the web address is www.muscatineRaceForTheSchools.org,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies, thank you. Do we have anyone else that would like to speak for Citizen Speaks? All right. Jerry, I'm going to turn it to you for board targets and goals, because I know you have a couple of
Great.
different things, and
Yeah.
I don't know who gets to start first.
Well, we do, and as Holly, you make your way up to the podium, I'll kind of give the board a brief update on our coronavirus situation. We have been, as you know, we have been following this pretty closely for a while, and we have announced an international travel ban for school groups, and probable limitation on other travel. We've already made a decision on a couple of trips that would be in the United States that we are canceling at this time. And this is following the direction from the Iowa Department of Public Health and CDC. And it's not just a matter of fear of infection, especially going overseas. You could be in a quarantine situation. You could be in a situation of needing health care or being overseas. We just want to we will want to err on the side of caution for our students. Now, as I see that since that announcement, the Muscatine Orchestra boosters have decided to not adhere to that recommendation and to continue with a European trip over spring break. The orchestra booster trip is being made out of the scope of the school district control without the support or guidance of the district. And that means that they are assuming the legal liabilities and responsibilities for those members of the traveling party. The Muscatine School District's liability insurance will not be available, as this is a non-sanctioned trip. Things like travel changes, possible quarantines, and any legal actions and or expenses will not become the responsibility of the district. And we certainly hope their trip goes off without a hitch. But again, the way things are changing so quickly with this, that drove us to make the decision to limit foreign travel at this time. Are there any questions?
Is the orchestra teacher going along with them?
Yes.
He is still going?
Yes, yeah. It's over spring break, so folks can travel and that type of thing, and we certainly aren't saying people can't travel. We're just, as a school district, not sponsoring any travel and taking on that responsibility.
Do we have any kind of a policy when they come back? Are they going to be?
They will follow the guidelines of whatever it is at that time. Currently, the countries they're visiting is kind of a self-monitoring for 14 days. Now that can change daily. Just today, Italy shut down the entire country. So things can change and change rapidly with this, but that would be the protocol. We did notify staff today too that, because we'll have a lot of staff traveling, lots of different places. If for some reason they would be in a quarantine situation on a personal trip, a trip of their choice, they would be able to use their allotted paid time off for that quarantine period. If they don't have that time or it's been used, it would be a dock pay situation. If a teacher is exposed in a work-related setting, we would place him on paid administrative leave. So we let staff know how that will look, and knock on wood that none of this will come to pass. But things in a community can happen really quickly, and we want to try to be prepared for this as much as we can.
And we're following a similar stance that the Board of Regents for the state of Iowa has taken.
Iowa
so
City.
This is not, yeah.
Yeah, you know, the lion's share of educational travel in the United States is done at the college level, and so CDC specifically mentioned that, but the Iowa Department of Health broadened that to say students, and which makes sense. It just, when you go overseas, there's lots of things that can happen, you know, we just want to not put people in a situation that we can't be confident is going to be static.
Jerry, what steps did we take for the band trip that attendees, parents got this information? What's that look like?
Well, we contacted each trip attendee, and I believe there were 64. 61, something like that.
Orchestra.
Yeah. It's a little bit different. We had another trip that was to the Netherlands that was also canceled. It's a little bit different that the boosters kind of ran all of this through the boosters. So we weren't aware of the travel list and those kind of things. We did get that, so I wanted to make sure everybody understood the school's stand on that. But you know, like I said, I wish it could be different, but.
And Jerry, as I mentioned before, you know, I do totally agree with you because, you know, it's better to be safe than sorrow later on. And I think as a school district, we need to follow the procedure that the officials are setting for us. So thank you.
Yeah, I would second that, Dr. Reeby. Thank you for trying to stay in front of this and keep everybody informed. Thank you for trusting our experts. And if our experts are telling us that this is what we should do, then I think that we need to follow that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
We are continuing to work through, if this escalates, what that might mean and what those plans look like. So we'll do our best to try and be as prepared as possible.
You gave up, there was a lot of weekend time that went into this in conversations, and you and I spoke
Yeah,
a couple of different times.
You
but
know, we had there were a lot of people that were consulted on this. It wasn't made. I didn't make this alone in the basement. We tried to get a lot of input on this, and I understand that some people feel like you know, it may be overly cautious. But again, in 42 years, I've never had a parent come up and say, "Thank you for taking a risk with my child." So we will always err on the side of caution.
Well, thank you for all the time that was spent on that.
So Holly, we are so excited to have you here representing the Curriculum Management Services that conducted our Curriculum Audit a few months ago. And we're just really looking forward to what you have to tell us about where we can go and how we can get better.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I was trying to remember when I was here last year, just sharing about the audit process and what that entails. I think that was last fall, correct? So here we are, several months later, after the audit. Everybody's a little bruised and battered, but that's... I said at the time, nobody asks for an audit for a pat on the back, because that's not what we do. We go into school districts and we do such a deep dive, a very comprehensive evaluation of really everything in the system. And an audit report highlights where there is needed improvement. So it's a deficit report. So we do point out all the things that need to be improved. Having said that, I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to come and speak to all of you in person, because I can, one, speak to the status of your system in comparison to other systems that we see nationally, and two, I can affirm all the really good things that you have in your district and that you have going on here that are actually extremely important and really positive. And so I'm going to go through the main highlights of the report, but if you have any questions, I've done this countless times. So you won't get me off script or anything like that. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I want this to be a conversation. So these reports are really meaningful when you all understand them and get a grip or get a good handle on where you think you need to go next. And that's where I want to spend the most time, but first we're going to go over just a few of the findings, because some of them I think are pretty significant. Let's see if this works. Turn it on. There we go. All right. So this is really the foundation of our model. We have 5 standards that we compare the district to, but all 5 standards focus on this graphic right here. We are looking to see how well these things align in the system. And so we look to see written curriculum, which we call the work plan, assessment, which we say is the work measure, and then teaching, what's actually delivered in classrooms. And that, for us, is the work. That is the work. And teaching, so all of this is all predicated on the idea, and quality is all based on how well do these 3 things align to get student learning and result in student learning. Because for us, that is the most important thing, what your kids are actually walking away with. So for us, alignment, that is absolutely fundamental to improving student achievement. It is the district's responsibility, from our perspective, to support and facilitate that alignment. So in other words, it would be unfair to expect an individual teacher to take responsibility for alignment of the written, taught, and tested. Although that happens in many districts, where they call that the teacher responsibility. We also say that alignment must be realized by teachers and principals in the schools. So even though it's not fair to expect that to be only a teacher's responsibility, it is a main focus of their responsibilities and their position. But they need to do that with support from central office. And we also know that everything that's taught in the classroom, that is what we want to rely on to prepare students for anything they need to be successful on in the future. So whether that be a test, whether that be real-world contexts, it's really what happens in the classroom that we want to look to and rely on to predict how well they're going to do in those situations. Because we don't have control over anything when they go home. So that's really why we talk about this. So in looking at our graphic again, this alignment triangle, if you look at curriculum and the assessment, we say that alignment of those 2, that's the easy part, because that's alignment that happens in design. That's where you have your documents. You have written curriculum and you have assessment tools. And you can pretty tightly align those 2, developing curriculum to make sure that you're incorporating what's on assessments, developing assessments to reflect what's in the curriculum, with everything being based on state standards and aligning to what the state is also using for summative measures. But the next piece, this is where it gets tricky. And if you look, 2 of the 3 sides for successful alignment are based on how well what is getting delivered in the classroom aligns back to curriculum and assessment. And this is where assuring quality is challenging. And I was talking to Jerry prior to the board meeting. I said, and I'm going to speak a little bit to vision and mission shortly, but you can have so many great things at central office and so many goals and intentions, but it really boils down to what decisions that individual teachers make in their classrooms as to what is actually going to be aligned. And that's what determines the activities and the learning that kids walk away with. It's those decisions that teachers are making. And that's really profound. The more that you think about that, the more critical that becomes, because you have a lot of teachers in your system, and knowing and understanding what's their interpretation of the learning that kids are supposed to leave with, their interpretation of the resources, their interpretation of the standards, and even their interpretation of the assessments. And so it's a lot bigger than you think and a lot more complicated than we realize. So, and we know this because we know teachers. And we know that with delivery, because that is what is happening in classrooms, that it's as much about what is being taught in terms of the concepts, skills, knowledge, as it is about the how. So how kids practice those concepts and skills, how they are engaged, how they are practicing or demonstrating their learning, and also at what types of cognitive demand. So what's the cognitive rigor? We are seeing a ton of information right now in research about this one issue right here. Cognition, type of cognition, how kids are expected to think in the classroom. Because the Common Core, when the new standards came out several years ago, that was a huge thrust of the standards in the college and career readiness skills, was critical thinking and getting kids to be more thoughtful, problem solve, and be able to think independently. And what we're seeing, and this is national, this is not anything unique to Muscatine, that nationally the rigor is actually very low. And how we are cognitively engaging our kids is not where we want it to be. Even in districts that call themselves high performing or promote themselves as being very rigorous and having higher standards for rigor, it's not where teachers think that it is, the cognitive demand. And so that's been something that everybody is very concerned with and very aware of, and how do we do this? And that's something I want to speak to, and that some of our findings speak to as well, but also our recommendations. So just tuck this one away in your back pocket, because we're going to keep talking about.
Can you define, how do you define rigor?
Wow, great question. You guys should be defining rigor for sure, because that's part of your job. That's actually something that when you research rigor, people have different definitions for it. So sometimes it is important, we believe, for districts to say, okay, we want college and career readiness skills. So if those skills that are in the college and career readiness that are described there, if those describe rigor for you all, then it's really good to say this is how we are defining. And sometimes I stay away from using the term rigor because some people, they interpret that negatively. It has a negative connotation for them. So I sometimes will say the level or type of cognitive demand. So how much kids have to really think, problem solve, analyze, think critically. So in other words, assess a situation, get lots of different sources of information about something before they draw a conclusion or reach a verdict or make a judgment. So all of those are things that we don't define very well in this country. There is no single consistent definition everywhere. And so it's up to school boards and district leaders to say, okay, for us, here's what we mean by this when we say we want to see cognitive demand and cognitive engagement in our classrooms. So, but that's an excellent question. Let me go back to this one really quick, because what we also know is that without alignment, the biggest predictor for how kids are going to do on a norm reference test, like the Iowa tests or the ACT, is socioeconomic status. It is their income level. And that has been consistently true for decades. And on the SAT, there's actually, for every $10,000 in parental income, there's about a 17-point gain. So there's a statistically significant correlation between income and test performance when it's normed on a bell curve. It's not true when when it is a criterion reference test, when it's not normed on a bell curve. So that's important to understand. But we know that that doesn't have to hold true when alignment is present and when what is being taught in the classroom does equip kids for success on whatever measure you're using. So we look to see, okay, when we come into a school district, we look at absolutely everything. We talk to pretty much any human being that will talk to us. We interview all different stakeholder groups, every principal, as many teachers as we can, and we also have online surveys that we administer. We opened up to every single teacher and the principals, and I think we interviewed every board member of the acting board at the time. And so we are looking to see, okay, how well are all different departments within the district working together in coordination to support alignment? And when I say alignment, that is that focus on what's actually happening in classrooms. And I say that repeatedly because sometimes people can forget. I go into districts that maybe have 100 schools, and it gets real easy to forget at central office that they're here for children. And because they're never at schools. There are people at central office that are never out in the buildings, and they're not visiting classrooms, and that's really the most critical thing. Fortunately, that's not the case here. I love going into smaller systems because there's very much an awareness of children and the needs of kids and why we're all here. So we did that with, and I want to share just quickly about our tightly held versus loosely held decision-making continuum. So this little graphic shows that we believe there are certain things that really should be decided at the district level, that it's appropriate for the board and administration to say, no, for the whole system, we're all in agreement on this. We're all on the same page on these things. Those are the things on the left. Those are things like the ends, the vision for the system, the mission, goals, standards, priorities, also student objectives. That's not a shocker since you already have state standards that are required, but we like you to have a little more refinement of those standards because standards in and of themselves don't have enough specificity or clarity for teachers. And I'll speak to that a little bit later, but that's a struggle that we actually have seen nationally. It's another struggle why for teachers making decisions about what they're teaching and how they're teaching when they're trying to interpret those standards. Because of that lack of clarity, I think that's why we're seeing a corresponding lack of cognitive engagement or cognitive demand. Because the teacher's job is just very demanding. And without supports and specificity, teachers are making decisions and sometimes don't have time to think things through. And so they maybe are defaulting to a less rigorous activity. The more rigorous activities, the more demanding activities also take more time, and they're more challenging to evaluate. So we say student objectives based on those standards should also be tightly held, as well as assessment, that there are assessment, both formative and summative. We say those should be held at the system level, not necessarily the pacing, because teachers need to have some flexibility in pacing of when they give certain formative measures, certain instruments, certain tools, when they use those with their kids, based on when the kids need them. But for annual and for benchmark assessments, that those things should be standardized at the district level. We also say assessment should be tightly held so that you can compare across courses. So if you have 10 Algebra 1 courses, if everybody's using a different test, you don't know that the kids are all leaving with the same content knowledge, which actually we see this all the time in districts. On the right side, and this is equally important, are those things which we say should be flexible. So we call it loosely held, but I don't want anybody to understand that like it's a free-for-all, because it's not. Because anything that's on the right should still align back to what's on the left. So if you have, we say that on the right, those are decisions that should be left to schools and teachers, that they need to be able to have some autonomy over those things so they can respond to their students' needs. So that means instruction, strategies, groupings, staffing, processes, resources, materials, those things we say there should be some flexibility as long as they align back to the things on the left. So here are our 5 standards, and the findings in the report are all organized by the standards, and I'm going to go through each one and just summarize the findings for you, and then talk a little bit about the recommendations. Hopefully a lot more about the recommendations. But before I get into the findings, I want to just speak to several of the things that we saw in the district that were really strong and are very worthy of mention. This is, I think, the very first, probably the second audit, and I've been around now doing audits for over 25 years. But this is just the second one that I've seen where the contract was actually initiated and held by the board, intentionally, because the school board was so just very focused on getting this comprehensive feedback for the system, and also having a new superintendent coming in, having a really good baseline set of data to give to a new leader. It's very unusual. I think that's a tremendous strength. I was very impressed when I met with the board last fall at the questions that they asked and the interest that they showed in what a report like this represents. Also knowing that it's not easy getting a report that highlights all your deficiencies. That's not easy. That's a real blow to your ego. But it's also really useful in getting to that next level of performance, that next level of quality in a system. I also want to speak to the AP enrollment and the increase in the AP courses in the system. And I know that this is a direct result of a commitment from the board and from administration to increase cognitive demand of kids and increase college and career readiness across the system. And we have seen a significant increase in the number of AP courses that are offered and being taken in the district, and I think that's a real strength. When I first read the report, this, for me, this next bullet was absolutely shocking. This was the one that had my mouth open because it's so unusual. When I saw over the last 5 years the increase in the identification of gifted children who represent the lowest income levels, that was astonishing to me. You have done incredible work in the identification of low-income students. That is extremely unusual. That is something we almost never see. And even though you still have some disproportionality, your disproportionality is much less than what we typically see in districts with similar demographics to this size and ethnic makeup. So I think you are really to be commended for that. I also know, being an educator and having worked in districts, that changes like this are never simple or easy. It's a big shift in the community. It's a big shift in your school communities, within the schools themselves. And change can be hard. It's needed, but it's also hard. So we'll see, I think, some of the results of that in the report, that there have been these changes over the last several years. And, but I want to say that the results are really commendable. And then your financial position. You have declining enrollment. I know you've had to make some tough decisions about buildings, but you are in a really good position financially. That's actually another super positive characteristic, and you should be very proud of yourselves for that, because that's some good money management. Money matters. It really does in education. And when you have declining enrollment, it means you are having reduced funds every year. Another thing, and I am from Iowa, which I love, and we're Iowa nice, right? We're very nice people in Iowa, and I think it's always, my kids, I have one son that lives in Tennessee now, but all my kids are very proud of the fact that they're from Iowa, and they say, you know, in the Midwest, people just are so caring, and they have such a good heart. And we definitely saw that in Muscatine. Our team was very impressed with the level of care, the ethic of caring in this district for children. Not just, and I think that does begin at the top. I caught a very strong sense of that ethic when I was here last fall, and the whole team saw that repeatedly with the different stakeholder groups that they met with and while they were touring classrooms. I think that it's a real privilege for me, because I travel all over the country and I meet teachers and visit school districts in many, many different states. I'm always blown away with what good people teachers are. And the vast majority of them really do care about kids, but they don't know what they don't know. And I almost never see a teacher doing anything out of malice or bad intent. If they're doing something that isn't beneficial to kids, it's because they don't realize it. Or they just lack the tools to do what's best for the child, for the student. So And I think that's really important to say that because in going through the findings, we really do, as an organization, we have a profound respect for teachers. And this is not to be a reflection on teachers. This is a reflection on the system as a whole, because teachers are only as good as the support that they receive from the system. So, and just so I can add this too, I have 2 children right now who are in teacher prep programs. So my daughter is student teaching, and my son just switched to elementary education, so, which I'm very excited about, at Iowa State, though. Okay, so let's talk about standard 1, and this is kind of the boring standard, but it's actually super important, because this is the standard that's about control. We say control, but really with this, it's about governance, and it's about that mission and those goals, and making sure that you have clearly defined roles and responsibilities for accountability. Because everybody needs to know, okay, what are my responsibilities? What am I supposed to do? What's my part in this? So that things coordinate and work well together. That's important for that coordination and cohesion. And so that's what this standard is about. So in looking at standard 1, we look at governance, we look at effectiveness, we look at policy, plans, any document that directs decision-making, basically. So you will see these themes in our findings. So the first finding, and this is one that this is a finding that you would see probably in every district across the country, that policies are present, your policies are compliant, but we have very strict criteria and things that we look for in policy. And we found that your policies need some work, specifically regarding curriculum, the role of curriculum, and how curriculum and assessment are to support instruction in classrooms. And that's not unusual. I will also say that if I have to prioritize, we'll get to this when we talk about recommendations, but in prioritizing the work in a smaller district, if I were going to pick, okay, let's either work on curriculum and professional development for teachers in how to teach it versus policy, I'm going to go with the curriculum and the PD for teachers. Because policy work, while important, is not as critical in small districts because you get a lot done just with good communication. But policy is important for accountability and for clarity. And so we always have a finding regarding that. We also found that your org chart, and again, not surprising in a small system, you have a document that shows positions and what they're responsible for, but you don't have what we call an organizational chart in the business world, which is who reports to whom, that there are clear lines of authority. We look for comparability of compensation, all of those. We have different standards. They're all outlined in the report for you. This for us is pretty critical because I mentioned before the design delivery connection for alignment. Because design work is what happens at central office, it's really important that you have an organizational structure that clearly shows how delivery is supported by design and how those responsibilities intersect. We go into a lot of systems where there's a lot of work done at central office that never gets delivered at school sites. It never makes its way down to classrooms. And that's really critical. So because principals are sort of your main person at each building, you need to have a clear structure for not only their support, but also their training and understanding in what the central office is trying to do. So, and if you have any questions on this, feel free to ask, but we like to use the military analogy for this, line and staff, that people on the line are the people in the trenches. They're the ones actually fighting the battles. Your staff are the people that exist to support the line. We see central office as staff. So work on curriculum and work at the central office exists to support the people on the line. And those are your teachers and the principals, and they're the ones in the trenches. They're the ones that need the support. But at the same time, they need to remember, well, what are we fighting the battles for? Right? So somebody has to keep them focused on the larger strategy, because they're waging the battles, but they don't see the larger war. And that's the role of central office. So keep that in mind. And again, because you're small, people know what they're supposed to do usually, but it's not anywhere in writing. And we like to see things in writing. So another one is on your planning, and there's definitely planning happening in your school district. There's no question about that. And you have a strong long-range plan. You also have a very strong vision, mission, and goals for your system. Your plan, however, didn't fully meet all of our criteria. And more importantly, we didn't see a really strong connection between district planning and what schools have in place for plans. And we want to see greater cohesion and connections with that. So, and that's another way that we get, that delivery can align with design. So this finding, and I spoke with Jim Farrell, who is your project lead about this one, about communication. And I think this finding really arose because of all the change that has taken place over the last several years. And like I said, especially in smaller communities that have a strong, long history, change can be rough, and keeping communication strong and open about that change is always a challenge. And then you communicate things, and then you hear what people actually heard from what was communicated, and that can be a bit of a disconnect too. So communication has to be two-way, but that's always a challenge in making sure that what we're saying is being understood and with the same intent. So we found that there have been some misunderstandings from stakeholders in the community and some different perceptions, and that people, there was a sense from the community, from parents, and from teachers, I think, that decisions were made without enough collaboration or input. And so I think that's something that in moving forward, and remember that's perception, not necessarily reality, but in moving forward as a board and with the new superintendent thinking through how do we solicit input effectively? What are effective ways of getting collaboration from our parents and from our community members? That is always a challenge for district leaders, and I will just tell you that nobody has the magic. There is no single right answer, because it all depends on your community and depends on your stakeholders as to what's going to work. And you all hear things as board members and being out in the community, and as my husband, who's a therapist, likes to say, there's he said, she said, and then somewhere in the middle is the truth. So. And that's just going to be your ongoing challenge. But I think that for the new superintendent coming in, and we have a recommendation on this, and thinking through decision-making models, processes for doing that, and how you really involve more people in making decisions, that's going to be important. So that's really it for Standard 1. Any questions on those findings? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Standard 2. Standard 2 is really our curriculum standard. That's the direction standard, and that's where we talk about everything that's related to curriculum and its development, design and development, but not its delivery, because delivery is Standard 3. But Standard 2, so this is really standards, objectives, and what documents, what plan or blueprint do teachers have from the system to plan their instruction, to guide them in making decisions on delivery. So we look at, is there curriculum? Is there a document or some kind of blueprint or work plan for teachers that they can rely on to plan their instruction, to decide what they're going to do? And that's a question that we actually ask your teachers. We say, well, how do you decide what you're going to teach on a given day? How do you know? And I'll tell you what, that's a really revealing question for a lot of teachers. And so we looked at that. This is a point that we try to make in every audit report, and we try to get the word out about this as much as possible, because I've met with so many board members and community members that now that we have state standards, and I'm from a generation that was prior to state standards. I mean, I remember when Iowa had none, right? And I tell people that, and they're like, what? And standards are wonderful, and standards are terrible. They're wonderful because now at least we have some common idea of concepts, skills, and knowledge that we want our kids to walk away with. They're terrible because, yes, they give us some idea, but they don't specify exactly what that needs to look like in a third grade classroom, in a fourth grade classroom, in a fifth grade classroom with the specific resources and materials. So while they are a huge step in the right direction, what we've seen happen in many districts is people thinking, well, you have standards, why do you need curriculum? And before standards, everybody worked on curriculum because there weren't any standards. So curriculum was, yes, of course we need curriculum because they didn't have any standards. Now that there are standards, people are still struggling through, well, well, we have standards. Why do we need curriculum? Or we have standards and we have a textbook. Isn't that enough? And let me just tell you, no, they're not enough. Standards are not enough. Resources are not enough. Textbooks by themselves are so not enough. And we do so many evaluations on the quality and alignment of textbooks, and I could stand and talk to you for days about that. They are very useful as tools, but they cannot serve, they're not sufficient to serve as a curriculum for teachers, even though some of them are even being written as scripted. You know, teachers can just read them. They're scripted, which is another terrible thing, I think. So we say, too, that standards alone also are not sufficient because they really aren't clear about how kids need to demonstrate that content in their learning. And so we say that curriculum must exist to do these three things. And this is actually, these three things are so important. The first one is to focus. Standards are too broad. The curriculum needs to take the standards and really focus. What is essential? What are the learnings? I use this, this analogy in another district. I said, okay, this was a district that has hurricanes. I said, if you had a hurricane and you were all shut down and you had 1 month to teach your 9 months of content, what would you focus on? And they were like, oh. Right? I mean, it's worst case scenario, but man, does that really help you realize what's really important? We only have so much time with our children, and we want to maximize our use of that time. So curriculum has to help teachers focus. The one thing that we hear from teachers more than anything when they are using a program that was adopted, like a Journeys or Engage New York, it's overwhelming. There's so much. They don't even know where to begin. And so they're just picking stuff to keep kids compliant and busy, and because they're so overwhelmed, and because nobody has said, no, wait a minute, this is the skill that's really important. If you spent 80% of your time on this, you would be fine. Your kids are going to be fine. And teachers don't know how to they don't always know. We approach curriculum as what an inexperienced teacher needs. Not your rock stars, right? Because most of the time they don't even need that stuff. But your inexperienced teachers. So we say curriculum has to focus. It has to provide that focus, and it has to connect the learnings in some logical sequence. So even though the standards are grade level, some of the standards are almost identical from one grade level to the next. So for a teacher, you know, they're not born knowing what does that look like at 4th grade versus 5th grade. If the standard is identical, what's the difference in student performance? So the curriculum has to provide that kind of clarity and connect it in a logical sequence. Having those connections also helps make sure that what our kids are learning does spiral and connect from one grade level to the next. It helps us eliminate gaps and overlaps. My kids always told me if they read a book like in 7th grade and then they had to read the same book in high school, guess what I heard at home? Mom, I read that book in 7th grade. Now we have to read it again, and we're going to spend 6 weeks on it. And I think, wow, if we have better coordination, but see, some of those decisions have to happen at a system level, because teachers won't always make those decisions on their own. And then the last one is an equity piece, because when you don't have curriculum and there's more latitude in what kids are learning, that can become an equity issue of access. Because if my child is in a class that is getting this Algebra 1 content, but this child is in a different class and they're learning different things, that's an equity issue. Then they're not learning the same content. We never expect teachers to teach the same way. And we don't expect them to use all the same activities. But we do expect the learnings, the content, to be the same for kids. And that's really the intent of the standards. So our findings relate to those ideas. And the first one is about planning to support curriculum design and development. We like a district to, because this is such critical work, this is the plan for the most critical work in the district. This is the plan to support teaching. The curriculum is the work plan. So we say we like to see that the district actually has planning around curriculum design, so what it looks like and what it's going to contain, development, how it's going to be written, what's going to be put in there, who's going to be at the table writing it, what is it going to look like, delivery, what are expectations around teaching the curriculum, how are we going to train people in teaching it, how are we going to monitor, and what are principals doing to support its delivery, and then about evaluating it, assessment. How are we going to evaluate our kids' learning based on what we say in the curriculum they should be learning? So that is really, this is probably next to a strategic plan or a long-range plan, this is the most important plan in the system. This one right here. Because this hits the most important functions of the system related to curriculum and teaching. And so we found that you don't have a plan, and there is some planning in place in terms of an idea. There's been a lot of work in recent years to secure resources and materials for teachers so that they aren't teaching in a vacuum. And let me just tell you, that's actually huge. Because I've been in many districts where teachers they just hand them standards and they're using textbooks from 10 years ago. So there has been work making sure that teachers have resources and materials. There's still more work to be done in this area. And having a plan or something at the district level that outlines for everyone in the system, okay, we need to get our head around what document, what curriculum we're going to put in teachers' hands, and how it's going to define standards and provide assessment tools to our teachers. And scope of curriculum, we look to see of all the courses that you're teaching, which ones have a curriculum. And we found that scope was adequate at elementary, mostly because you had Engage New York and you had resources and materials in teachers' hands, so teachers did have something. And for scope, we don't care if it's any good, we just care that there's something in place, because something is always better than nothing. But at secondary, it was not adequate. We didn't see adequate. And for us, core courses, we say 100% of core courses should have some kind of curriculum, 70% of non-core. For us is how we determine adequate. And that's kind of an arbitrary thing, but that's just always what we use. Now, so finding 2.2 is on the scope or the coverage of curriculum. Finding 2.3 is on the quality. And I want to speak to this just a little bit. So this is where we looked at what teachers have for curriculum documents, and we evaluate them against our own criteria. Most of what teachers have at elementary are purchased materials. So there's Journeys and Engage New York. Those things have a lot of the components that we look for, and we did some analyses of these as well, but they aren't specific enough or strong enough to meet our criteria for quality. So even though they have a lot of resources and materials in them, the quality doesn't meet our expectations. Now, you also have pre-AP, which is
Springboard.
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 Thank you, which we've actually done an audit of Springboard materials. We looked at Springboard, we looked at Journeys, and we did a little analysis of those, and I'm gonna share that with you later, but Springboard is a really high-quality program. We didn't evaluate Springboard we typically don't evaluate resources as curriculum. That's just something that we typically don't do, but I can tell you that any of the resources that you have in your district, I could take and still use and build curriculum that relies on those resources. Springboard is one of the highest quality programs that we've ever encountered, just in terms of what it provides to teachers. So I can say that for curriculum and as a resource, it's one of the strongest that we've ever seen, and that we actually audited the Springboard materials. So we don't endorse programs, but it is a good one, but it still only goes down to 6th grade, correct? Fifth? Oh, it goes to 5th now, okay. So you also have you probably would have some issues then too with articulation, so the vertical spiraling from elementary up to Springboard. And in one of our findings, we did analyze Journeys. Journeys is very, very cognitively low. Springboard, on the other hand, is high. So cognitive demand of Springboard materials is pretty good, is actually very good, depending on how it's being used. We never know how it's going to be used, but Journeys is pretty low. So if Journeys is what teachers are to rely on in building up to 5th grade for Springboard, or whenever Springboard's being used, it would be a disconnect. I mean, that would be an issue. So our big takeaway, yes, you have curriculum documents, you have some good resources in place, you have enough you can build off of. But there's definitely work that can be done with those materials so that teachers are really maximizing their potential. Questions on that?
So I have about 3 questions.
Yep, go ahead.
First, are you saying, I don't want to say you specifically.
Sure.
Do you think that the scope and sequence of a book or of materials, is that more of a hindrance, or is that more of a crutch, or where does that fall in its usefulness with teachers? Because I think, I have my own opinion of it, but
Yeah.
what did you find out? Because you said one of the first things you did is ask teachers,
What do you use?
what do you use?
Yeah. Do you want to hear what they use?
Yeah.
We actually did ask teachers. I can't remember if I have that on a specific slide. I think I might have. We have a lot of exhibits in the report, if you noticed. I think the number one things that teachers quoted as using in planning their instruction was their own ideas. That was the number one. The second thing, let me look and see, because I know I have that in the exhibit. In what teachers use. Hold on, that's in finding 2 point. Yes, it's on page 88 of the report. Now remember that in this exhibit, we usually see, and I could break this down for you, I could give you the raw data, because we see usually very different responses between elementary versus secondary when asked this question. State standards was the number one thing that teachers cited, and right after that, online resources, I locate myself. So teachers could name as many things as they wanted in response to this question when we asked them what they used, and this was on the survey. 58% of teachers said that they do use the state standards. That's not a surprise. Teachers always, if they have a course that is a standard, that has standards, because not all courses have standards. If they have a course that has standards, they almost always cite that. But the second thing that they cited, 57% of teachers cited this, was online resources. That's also not a surprise. We see a lot of that nationally from teachers, like Teachers Pay Teachers and some of those. And some of them are quite good, and some of them are quite terrible. So we see, so when we get to the finding on student artifacts, I'll speak a little bit more to this. But I think your first question about like a scope and sequence and things that you do get from a resource, that is actually very helpful and I think important for teachers, because at least it provides a structure and a pace for this massive content that is the standards. And if you look at English language arts and you look at the number of standards that teachers are expected to teach, it is so overwhelming and there's so much overlap. And which skills are most important and what am I spending most time on? And so for teachers, having something that scopes it out and sequences it, that's super important. So if they get that from the resource, great. That's better than nothing. That's why we say something is almost always better than nothing. We don't fully appreciate how important structure and pacing is to teachers in making sense of all the content, if that makes sense, especially for elementary teachers who are teaching everything, right, all day long. The third thing that teachers mentioned in looking at that was my own ideas and resources. That was another, that tied with online stuff. That was 57% of the teachers that said that. District adopted textbook and resources was also cited by 57% of the teachers. So now, none of that is surprising, but is that what you want to hear from your teachers? I think that's also the bigger question. We want state standards, but what we see in districts where, and these are, like I said, these are very typical responses, but many times what we see in districts that have responses like this is we don't see the test scores that we want to see, especially for certain subgroups, student subgroups. And so we have to have greater clarity for teachers around what they're using and are they getting the best bang for their buck from what they're using. We say that resources should be flexible. Teachers can use more than just one resource, that it's, that's not something that's held tightly by the district. But if you're gonna do that and give teachers some flexibility over what they're using, you have to have very clearly defined objectives and a clearly defined curriculum. Because if teachers can use whatever they want, then that's, then you get chaos, free for all. And that's not good either. So, did that answer your question?
A little bit.
May I, Mike, before you ask your second question,
Sure.
I have just a follow-up here. Are you saying that we are driven by standards instead of learning? Is that what you are saying? Because, that's troubling for me because, for me, the learning and the quality of learning has to come first.
Right.
Regardless of the standards that we have, so.
That's actually a really good question, because I think if you asked any teacher what drives your instruction, they're gonna say standards, because that's state law. I mean, you're supposed to be teaching the standards. But when you make a decision about what kids are doing in a classroom, that's when it becomes learning, right? What kids are doing is what predicts their performance.
I would actually argue what they take out of the classroom and walk out the door with is
Yes.
learning. What happens in the
Yes.
classroom is not necessarily learning. That's
Wow,
the teaching that's taken place possibly. And I do see a difference between teaching and learning.
I do
at
too.
times.
I do too. I think it's both. I mean, and this is like great philosophical discussion for you guys to be having, because how we define teaching and learning is really important. What is learning? What defines the learning? Is it what teachers are giving them? Is it activities that kids are engaging in the classroom, or is it what they leave the classroom door with? And learning shouldn't just stop at the door, right? Because the more you learn, the more you learn. It's like the more you read, the better you read.
You mentioned earlier about, you said that we purchase instead of district created. And so I
Right.
guess the question I think I have when I say that is it that perhaps because it's not gonna come out sounding right.
Don't worry, you're not going to offend me.
Yeah. Does the purchase make that easier to deal with rather than having it be district created?
It absolutely can, yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do a lot of curriculum development work for districts, with districts. I never do it for them because that would be wrong. It has to be their product. And sometimes what they need is really a resource navigation tool versus a curriculum guide. Something that helps teachers use the resource more effectively. So yes, it can make it easier if the resource is high quality. Like the Springboard, I could write curriculum with the Springboard and it would be a lean and mean guide because what's in the Springboard material is really solid. So yes, in answer to that question.
Yes.
But in terms of what we want to see the district doing, we want to see the district creating documents that help teachers make better decisions regarding learning. And I think in answer to your question in thinking about learning, because I'm pretty passionate about learning and what kids actually are leaving with and what they walk away with, that's also based on how we're evaluating them too, right? I mean, that's why we need to assess them.
I think assessment, that's what I want to say, exactly. That's the assessment where it becomes
Yes.
a very important tool.
And that is where the rubber meets the road because, okay, we think I've taught it, we've practiced it, did they learn it? And that's what we have to know. And so this is all, right? You guys are peeling away at all these layers and thinking that through. And what we have for assessment tools can be really more valuable sometimes even than what we have for resources and materials. Because if the assessment helps define for us what that learning looks like, that's a powerful tool. Great thinking. Great questions. All right, so
Before you go on.
Yes.
You were saying too also that, our K-6 curriculum is adequate,
it's there.
okay?
Yes, you have every teacher that's teaching the core content subjects, because it's mostly core at elementary.
Right,
They all have some resource or guide that they can teach from.
okay. But then you said that our secondary, some courses have no curriculum at all?
Right, and that's probably non-core. A lot of the non-core courses, there's not necessarily a purchased resource,
Not a purchased resource.
electives.
Do they have
Right.
curriculum that they
They
have to
probably-
have some kind of guide?
Right. So a lot of times what teachers have is they have their own thing that they've developed, like maybe a syllabus or something for their class that isn't district developed. So we don't give credit if it's an individual teacher unless it's adopted as the district document. Because if they've developed it on their own and they're teaching this course and another teacher comes in and is also teaching that course, would they use the same document or would they each just do their own thing?
Well, are we talking about the same exact class?
Yes.
I expect the same way,
Right.
regardless who's teaching.
But that's not always how it pans out. That's not always how it plays out. And that's what we try to get at when we're determining, okay, what documents exist? Because some teachers, well, this is mine, I wrote this, I'm not just gonna, and some teachers are like, well, I don't want yours, I wanna do my own thing. If they're teaching theater arts,
Well, I can see the flexibility.
Sure.
Every teacher has
Right.
his or her own
Right.
way of teaching, but
Right.
at least the base has to be the same because, let's say, Algebra 1 here and Algebra 1 there should be Algebra 1 and not one Algebra 1 and one Calculus, for example.
Yes.
Level. So
now,
the
when
base
it's a
has to be-
core course, that's usually a little bit easier because with core courses like Algebra 1, there are standards at least. And I think in this instance, we didn't give credit for standards. If we gave credit for just the standards, it would probably be 100% at core in terms of having something, right? Because for core courses, there are already state standards in place for all of those core courses. But we usually look for something in addition to that that's beyond.
That
just
leads
the
to my
standards.
second question, because the state standards are, and you mentioned it with
Yes.
language arts, are overwhelming.
Yeah, they are.
How do you answer the question of creating the priority standards?
Right.
Because we face this all the time of, okay, if this is what the state says is important,
Right.
how can we say, well, yeah, that's kind of important, but this is more important?
Right, so we have several different things that we look at in determining priority standards, and this is something we actually have training on this because this is and this is something nationally that people are kind of talking about. One, we look at those skills that relate to college and career readiness. So we look at things that have rigor or cognitive demand, endurance, and I'm not going to think of the third one. Rigor, endurance, and because they're skills that last and that you need in other content areas, and I can't think of the third one. So there are some criteria we use. We also look to see what's on tests, what's being tested. So on state tests, AP exams, what are those skills of the standards that are most important? Oh, leverage, that's the other one. Endurance, leverage, and rigor are the three, that's kind of a three-pronged test. So if I looked at, let's take ELA standards in second grade. There are reading foundation skills and there are language skills. That's basically your phonics and your grammar and spelling, okay? None of those, even though they're critical for kids to learn them, none of those are priority standards because that's what they need to be able to do all the other making meaning stuff. So even though they have great endurance and leverage, they're not rigorous, but they are important. So, but when you're doing the other priority standards of understanding text, for example, reading and understanding them, you're applying all of those skills at the same time. So you're using them, and you're going to be mastering them, but you need them to do the more demanding skills, if that makes sense. So that's just a way of looking at the standards and appreciating the weight that we need to give to some of them. So I tell teachers all the time, it's not that you're not teaching those skills, but if you defaulted to only focusing on the phonics skills and not applying them in reading, you're kind of missing the whole point, right? So that's a challenge for districts all the time. What we want to do is help teachers navigate the standards so that we are landing on what's, cognitively speaking, rich for our kids and relevant. So that's the bigger challenge.
So my last question.
No, you're okay.
For right now, at least.
I love questions.
Where does, in any of your findings or anything that you're talking about, where does the instructional level of the student fall?
Ooh.
Because we want kids to be, in my understanding, about 85% successful, right? That's about that. That's the sweet spot, that they're still being challenged. They're having some where they have to overcome. And we know that not all of our kids are there, so where does that play into this?
So we looked at test data and your feedback, and I'm going to speak to that a little bit more because I think that's a big piece. Because Standard 4 is all about how are you using assessment data to determine success in learning. And there are a couple things that you need to be able to do that. So keep that in mind, and we will address that. So that was really it for Standard 2. I mean, just the need to plan around curriculum design and development and what they have, that you do have resources in the hands of teachers, but we would like to see some district-developed documents to support their use and their interpretation. So now we're going to get into Standard 3. Standard 3 is our standard that really looks at equity and also consistency and connections. So this is our one that we look what you have in design and is it being delivered and are you supporting delivery. So we look at that alignment, we look at consistency, we also look at professional development and monitoring. And we found that, now finding 3.1 is about access and equity issues. So you still have some disparities, but this is the one that over time we have seen huge improvement on this district-wide. So access to programs, AP access. You still have a pretty big discrepancy in gender, who's taking AP courses. You have way more girls right now, so that would be something that I would want to focus on, like, you know, why aren't boys taking AP courses? How can we get more boys in? Although boys, I think, are doing better when they take the test, they're scoring better of the boys that are taking AP. So that was interesting. So we look at access to different programs and enrollment in special education and GT. We look at it by gender, ethnicity, and also income level. So I mentioned the GT, that we've seen huge improvements in identification of GT kids, especially at some of your highest poverty schools. You have a couple of high poverty schools that still, one in particular that's done an incredible job. They have a huge increase in GT identification, and the other two have had improvements, but we would like to see that get even better. And then your special education and gifted and talented enrollment, I have a couple of charts to share with you. You had a few disproportionalities by ethnic group, but I will just tell you, GT has made big gains, and your special education, you're not too far off. So even though this is bad news, this is also a good news scenario that you're not doing badly. And I see a lot of districts, so you're really not doing badly in this area at all. And then the second one is on professional development, that you don't have planning, supporting PD. So PD for us is really all about supporting teachers and teaching the curriculum. I mean, for us, it's a pretty single-minded focus. Like, here's your curriculum, here's what you're supposed to be teaching, here are resources and materials to do it. We're gonna support you and train you and how to do that and how to make the best decisions in the classroom. And all of this is also based on what is our vision for what we want kids to be learning, and what does that learning, what should it look like? And I think that's important. So here are a couple of charts from Finding 3.1 on that equity issue. So this was your GT enrollment by ethnicity. So on the far left is white students, and then Hispanic, Asian, multiple ethnicities, Black, and then Native American and Pacific Islander. So the blue is their percentage in the GT program. The green is their percentage in the overall district enrollment. So if you look at this, white students comprise just over 60% of your student body, and they are about 70-some% of your GT program. Now, that is a big change over the last 3 years. I mean, that has improved somewhat, that those percentages are closer together, and that's what we like to see. We like to see that to be proportional. Hispanic students are little over 25% of your district population, and they're just under 20% of your GT program. So again, that almost 20%, that's an improvement over former years. You still have a little work to do. What was really surprising to me is your Black students, which are just a small percentage of your district enrollment, are overrepresented in GT, which we rarely see. So that was really interesting, but also good. And your Asian students are underrepresented in GT, which was also surprising. So this is just something to watch. And even though we say proportionally, ideally we'd like to see percentages close to district enrollment, this doesn't tell the whole story, because your percentages have improved greatly over the last 5 years. And especially, like I said, your identification of low-income students. This is a question that students were asked because we looked quite a bit at rigor, at cognitive demand of different things, and you all challenged us or tasked us with including a student survey, which I loved. That was great. This is one of the questions that we ask the kids if they feel challenged in their classes. And here's how they responded. They are organized by content area. We asked them about their specific content area. So on the far left, in English, we had 73% of the kids reported that they do feel challenged in their English classes, but then 28% said no. The disagreement was the highest for English. It wasn't significantly higher than the other content areas, but I think that's interesting. Math, you had really strong agreement that they feel challenged in math. So it was 80%, and then just 20% that disagreed with that statement. And then science was strong agreement, and social studies, so you can just see they were pretty similar across science and social studies. So, I mean, the good news is...
Can I ask a quick question
Sure.
on there? So, in other words, you're asking the same kids for each one of
Yes,
those subjects.
for each content
Which then,
area.
because I noticed those that strongly disagree pretty well
Yes.
about the same, which makes me wonder, who are those kids,
Yes,
you know?
yes. Yes.
And they're just not getting it for some
Right,
reason.
that they don't feel challenged, yes.
And same way, I want to look at it, it's almost on average between strongly agree and agree around 80%
Right.
in every area.
Yeah, which
So
is
we're
actually-
leaving around 20% that they believe that they are not challenged
Right.
in the school system.
Right. Now, the picture that we don't have, that we can't give to you, is what they would have said 3 years ago or
Yes,
4 years
yes.
ago. I mean, that's the piece that's missing. I actually think this is pretty high agreement with this. In my experience on student surveys, students are remarkably honest on surveys, which I love. And this to me is pretty good.
And that's what I want to say in the educational system, you know, no matter what you do and no matter how much you challenge them,
Right.
you're always going to have that number of students who wants more. And,
Yes.
and you know, I'm not quite sure if 20% will be the norm. I don't know,
yeah.
like, what's the norm, but it is
Right.
important to look into that group of, or population of students
absolutely.
and see really what they want from us so
Right.
that we can perhaps cater to them and perhaps help them
Right.
achieve a little
Right.
bit more. Yeah.
Well, and you all need to decide what you're comfortable with. Nobody has to be comfortable with the, 20-some% that don't feel challenged.
Was this all students?
Yes, this was just students.
No,
Oh,
I mean,
all
was
students.
it all students,
Oh,
or
I
was it
could tell you-
primarily,
I
was it
know it
primarily high
says-
school? Was it primarily middle school? Was it primarily?
Primarily high school. I think we administered, 6th through 12th on the student
Seems
survey?
right. That sounds right.
And we always, so with this exhibit, I know that we have percentages, or we have the total number included, but I can check on that and get that to you.
If it's in here,
Yeah,
I'll
it
find
should be. The number of kids we usually note what the number, the actual N.
What N is?
Yes, for each survey group. We have that
That's
for
fine.
teachers too. So. This is a good one on students and whether or not they reported feeling supported. This was very strong agreement. You had 75% of your kids say that they do feel supported in their classes, so with their learning. So I think that's good. And again, 25% that don't, you care about the 25%, obviously, but just remember that we're never done. Right? I mean, we're never done. We always want to see improvement. But this one was pretty positive. This was a question, this one had pretty high disagreement from the kids. They were asked how well teachers, so while they feel supported in their classes, the majority of kids, they were asked how well teachers relate the learning to real world, to themselves and to the real world. Almost half the kids disagreed with this. That teachers are relating the content to real world or to their personal experience, to the kids' personal experience. I think this is part of a bigger picture that we see here in Standard 3. Jerry's nodding his head. That for kids, I think they sense that ethic of caring in the classroom, but content is being taught probably in a pretty traditional manner that kids are struggling to connect with for personal relevance or relevance to real-world situations.
And that's part of the learning.
It is part of the
Again,
learning.
again, that's part of the learning.
Yes.
Yeah, because, if we're not showing them how to connect the
Right.
pieces into a real-life application.
And we also need to connect this back to your student demographics because your
Yes. Mm-hmm.
demographics are very diverse. I mean, you are ethnically diverse. This is not Iowa from 50 years ago. Muscatine is a very ethnically, racially, linguistically diverse community. That has an impact on how kids relate to the content as well, how they relate to those. And actually the research on cultural lens and how your cultural lens impacts learning is actually huge. It's huge. We don't understand it enough, but 99% of our teaching workforce, or 98% of our teaching workforce is white, middle-class white. So we have a lens disconnect sometimes. And that's something that we need to be aware of and working to support our teachers in.
And there is nothing wrong about that, but
No.
I think I will connect
you.
what you are saying now with a piece that we talk about, which is professional development.
Yes.
That's where we can perhaps put our resources to move that.
Yeah.
forward.
Thank you for saying that, it's not a judgment thing, it
Yeah.
just is. I mean, everybody has their own cultural lens, and that's the reality, that's human nature, and we just need to recognize that and work through that. But kids come to us with their cultural lens.
Yes.
Question?
This chart
Yes.
talks about kids and interest to the real world. Is it that they're just not getting it, or is it that the real world we aren't teaching to? As quickly as the world is changing, because I'm just thinking of my daughter, and I will not call her by, I cover my name up and everything so she doesn't know, of things she said.
Yeah.
And she one time came, she's in 8th grade, and she said, "Dad, why don't they teach me something that I could use in my life?"
Right?
And so is it because our real world, or the kids, this version of kid,
Yeah.
real world,
Yeah.
we aren't keeping up?
Yeah. You know, I think it's all of it, right? And we are traditionally in education, we've been, we teach skills, and we don't always connect how those skills play out in real world scenarios. And let's face it, the real world is messy, right? I mean, when all of this comes together, you guys are in the workplace in the real world, and you're thinking back to what you learned in school, and I still have ahas where I realize things that I learned 20 years ago that I understand it in a new and deeper way now because of how I'm using it. And so I think that for our kids, that's always the challenge. But I do really think this idea of relevance, which relates to connecting it to the real world, that when kids can see relevance, at least on a personal level, if they can see, if they at least care about it in some way, they're more motivated and they remember it more. And I have a child who needed a 504, and if he can't see any connection or relevance to himself, it's all bets off. Forget it. I mean, his learning is in the tank. But if he cares about it, he's straight A. He will do whatever it takes if he cares about it and it's interesting and for him it's valuable or relevant. So, and how we do this is something I work with teachers and we talk about, because what makes it relevant for me isn't necessarily what makes it relevant for you, right? And that's where we have to be personalizing our kids' learning. We can't do that without their involvement and input. Yes.
And that can be achieved through telling stories, because stories are very powerful tools.
Stories are
and I
very
don't mean like the
powerful.
teachers telling the stories, but
the
the students
kids.
also sharing their own stories, which becomes very powerful too.
Yeah. Storytelling is very powerful, very powerful. In fact, some countries, when they start teaching reading, it's tell me a story, not let's learn the letters. It's tell me a story, because every preschooler has a story to tell. You just ask them. So here's another question about if the statement was, you are rarely bored in school. And this was, again, a little bit of a shocker, that over 3/4 of the kids disagreed that they are rarely bored, which means that 3/4 of the kids are bored in school, report being bored in school. And I think that goes back to cognitive demand and relevance. So this is one that really should matter. So while kids feel supported and cared for, and even, they feel challenged even more than this, but they're still bored.
The structure of day, do you know, and just your
Could
experience,
be.
what
I
you
don't know.
see?
Do you guys have block schedule? No. Well, because that's good. I'm not a fan of block schedule. But
I should know what you see. Something like that.
Yeah.
Is it structure of day? Is
I
it what-
think it's more the activities and the things in the classroom. We saw a lot of very teacher-centered instruction. When going through classrooms, it was mostly, now that's not terrible. At least kids weren't just doing worksheets or textbook activities, but it was more teacher-centered rather than student-centered. And if we saw small groups and kids in different groupings, it was more elementary, which is typical. But high school, it was much more of a traditional setting. And I think that's probably, when it's more teacher talk versus student discourse and students making meaning and students engaging with the content, students telling stories versus the teacher telling stories. So, and I, this is not pointing a finger at teachers at all. Please don't mistake that, because I don't want this to be any condemnation of teachers. But with all that teachers have to do, and they work so hard, there comes a point really with the most effective learning environments, kids should be the ones working the hardest, not teachers. And you have teachers going home exhausted because they are working harder than anybody, and we need to flip that. Kids should be going home exhausted, because thinking, it physically does wear you out. I mean, I can give you tons of research to support it, but when you make kids think, it wears them out. Thank heavens. But there's a reason for that, because the brain needs sleep to recover as well. So what we saw walking through classrooms, and I think this gets back to some of the questions you all were asking about, is it the structure of the day? I think it's what's happening in the classrooms, that there was a lot of whole class teacher-centered instruction. That was the majority. That's what we saw most frequently. Now, we also saw kids very engaged and compliant. I don't think we had anybody off task. I mean, your kids are good. They're really good. And they're cared for. But as far as really cognitively engaged, and they're really owning their learning and being independent learners, not so much. Not as much as I think you would like to see. And also in line with your vision for how you want kids to be learning, there's a disconnect there. So we did see some great strategies, and we saw a lot of effective practices, and we saw some that were not so effective. So there's, it runs the gamut, and you're definitely no worse than you're better than a lot of districts that I've seen. I think having teacher-centered classrooms is a strength over some other classrooms that I visited, of just doing seat work. And that can be an effective, teacher-centered can be effective as well, but I think hearing from your students, they would like something different. So the other piece with this one was on your monitoring process. And when I say monitoring, I don't want that to have negative connotations, because we see monitoring as coaching and support for teachers. We don't see, for us, monitoring should not be inspectional. But what your principals reported about monitoring, what we found is that there's not a lot of clarity about why they're doing it and what their role is in that. So there's a need for PD. Yes?
Pardon me.
No, go ahead.
When you did this, was it as in you just kind of picked which classes to go to, or was it a structure that was given to you?
Principals take us around, and we try to go into, I think we went into almost every classroom where there was regular instruction going on. We don't go in if they're testing or if there's a substitute teacher. And we go in anywhere from 2 minutes to 10 minutes, depending on what's happening and how long we stay, and we record just tons of information. I think what I want to say about this, when we do our walks through classrooms, it's a single day, a few minutes of one on an entire year. It's a one-time visit. It's not fair to say this is what's happening all the time in that classroom. So know that. But it is at least a snapshot of what we saw on our 3 days visiting. Is that typical? You all have to decide that, right? And you all have to decide, well, what do you want to be typical? And when I look at your Muskie way, rigorous academics, focus on career pathways, development of engaged future community leaders. You've got some pretty powerful statements there, and you all need to define, okay, that's what we want to see. What does that look like in terms of the student learning, right? And student engagement.
Well, the reason I say that is because I actually have done substitute teaching, and so there was different emphasis put on how you do that compared to being in a regular classroom. But when you were talking earlier about the difference between student-led and more teacher-led, so to speak, with it, pardon me, is, as the older they get, is that perhaps better to have more of the teacher-led? The reason I say that from the standpoint of, because then they go off to college and then they're in those big classrooms and it's going to be just teacher-led.
Yeah.
And so it's earlier on is more of that exploratory.
So, I've been in kindergarten classrooms where it was the kids knew exactly what they needed to do. They went into their groups and it worked like a well-oiled machine. I've been in high school classes, same thing, where they're going into groups and it's a well-oiled machine. I think that, you mentioned what's happening at universities. Yes, some universities still have, lecture halls, but we also are seeing more and more courses where kids are having to work in collaborative groups too. Mm-hmm. So, you're seeing everything, and colleges are changing some of that. Even my kids are at Iowa State, which is enormous, but my son is doing discussion groups more than anything in his ed courses. Thank heavens, right? I said, well, buckle up because you're going to have, ed psych, which will be a huge lecture hall. So I think they need everything. And ultimately, I think we need to think what they need in the real world. So it's just always a balance. And sometimes, there is a time and a place for teachers just sharing information and modeling and giving guided practice and doing that with kids. And there's also benefit of letting the kids kind of figure some of this stuff out on their own. But not chaos. It has to be, with an intent. But all really good questions. So as far as monitoring, it's happening. Principals are visiting classrooms, although we asked teachers how often they see principals and principals how often, and it wasn't always the same. So their perceptions weren't always the same. But in terms of our classroom visits, this is the one that I wanted to share of what we saw with cognitive demand. So if you look at the DOKs, DOK 3 and 4 are what we consider the higher, more rigorous cognitive demand. That was in only 9%. I think it was, 9% of your classrooms. 90% was DOKs 1 and 2 of what we saw of the cognitive demand in the classroom. This was also similar to what we saw in student artifacts. Of what we saw the teachers doing, it was mostly large group direct instruction or assisting kids. We did see small groups, if you look down, in 7%, and those were mostly at elementary campuses. Elementary schools. So just in terms of what the teacher we just noted what the teacher was actually doing when we walked into the room, to the classroom. Now this finding has to do with the samples of student work that were collected. I want to say a couple of things here. This, again, one piece of work that teachers submitted to us, we didn't get a huge number at secondary. We had 47 middle school, 43 high school, actual artifacts submitted to us across the 4 core areas. Elementary, we had over 200 and some over the 4 core areas. So we had a much larger sample from elementary. They were asked to give us something that demonstrates mastery or proficiency of the standard, and then they labeled the standard. And we got very few social studies artifacts, which that's the other piece, that social studies is not being taught as frequently as we would like. But that a lot of the reading stuff, which was from the resource, was pretty low, and the cognitive demand was low overall in what we saw at elementary. The good news is that secondary, the rigor, and this is reporting the rigor for middle school and high school on the right, was pretty good. This is actually really high. I don't think I've ever seen a district that had cognitive demand this high for secondary. But your elementary is a big concern. But I think that's also reflective of what teachers have got to work with in terms of the resources. So that's it. Any questions on the standard 3 stuff? Okay. So standard 4 is again on assessment, and just like with curriculum, we like to see plan to support assessment, and they should be very tightly connected, right? You're defining what you want kids to learn. We should see good assessments to measure that learning. We didn't find a plan or anything formalized regarding assessment in the system. You do have some assessments in place, but not enough. This was probably the biggest piece of the biggest gap is formative assessment in your district. The resource at elementary provides some assessment instruments, but you just don't have anything comprehensive district-wide, all content areas in terms of formative assessment. You're relying a lot on summative tools, which is from the state, and that's just not enough. Teachers need more. So what teachers are relying on more than anything, their own self-made tests. Now, that doesn't mean they're terrible, but nobody's controlling quality and alignment and rigor of those instruments because they're creating them themselves. So some of them could be really good, some of them could be really not good in terms of do they align with what the standards actually require. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from Standard 4.
Was that across grade levels, or was that, you're saying that you didn't see formative assessments across grade levels?
What you have is mostly at elementary, if you have anything. So you have actual formative assessments that come with the Journeys program and with Engage New York. So you actually have some ELA, some English language arts tools that are provided, and you have that in the math resource as well. But they're not required to be used either. So not all teachers are using them. And I think the FAST goes through, what, like third grade? Is it third grade? The FAST? Fifth grade? And I'll just tell you, I'm not a huge fan. I mean, the FAST is required with the state, and I'm not a huge fan. So, you have that, but it doesn't give you, I mean, it's mostly a fluency measure. So it's not giving, and with your diverse population, you need to be focusing on comprehension. And the FAST doesn't give you enough on comprehension. So just speaking from experience, because my background is bilingual and ESL, and so that's you have kids that can probably decode, but they don't understand what they're reading.
And that's for later on too. I mean, comprehension is what's important.
Comprehension is huge, and vocabulary is huge, and all of those things. And it does make a difference in how they're going to do on the Iowa test. I mean, it's that all. Our state tests in Iowa, unfortunately, are more of a measure of reading comprehension than any other content, even the math sometimes. So just know that, and that's a disadvantage. We don't have great summative tools in Iowa. So you need good formative tools. So that's probably your biggest hole. Now, you all remember, there's been a ton of work done over the last several years putting resources and materials into the hands of teachers. The assessment piece, I think that's been on the back burner because there were assessments that came with a lot of those resources and materials. But, we got to put out fires as they come. And so that's going to be the next phase, right? In refining, okay, here's what we have now, what are we? And I think that's a great place really to start, is thinking through that assessment piece and defining learning for your students. So your scope of assessment didn't meet our requirements. You didn't have enough assessments in place, which is not a surprise. So you didn't have planning for assessment, and you didn't have enough tools. Your trends, we looked a lot at your ACT scores, but I want to say something here about this. Because you're testing all your kids, you've had a decline. That happens everywhere when they start testing everybody. So I think it's wonderful that you're testing everybody. I think it's wonderful that you're paying for everybody to be tested. So there's no shock here that your ACT scores have gone down. I would expect that. Now it's, okay, what's going to happen from now on moving forward with our ACT scores? But again, remember, ACT is just one measure. I would like to see also, how are your kids doing on AP exams? How are we doing, are we getting better? Because you're increasing your number of kids taking AP exams as well. So you're still below the state. You've got work to do, but you're also getting higher numbers. So that's the good news with the bad news, and the one usually comes with the other. But I think it's still a good place to be. Your use of formative data is not where we want to see teachers report using assessment data, but the majority of what they're reporting is their own instruments. And we don't know the quality of those. That's the unknown. So they are limited because they don't have enough instruments. Your teachers just don't. They don't have enough assessment instruments to give them good, solid, quality, reliable, valid information on how their kids are learning. And that's pretty much it for Standard 4. Any questions about the assessment piece?
Does homework or feedback of any type fall into that into your any place.
Yeah, and I want to answer your other question too. So when we talk about homework, anytime a child does any activity, any task, anything, it's an opportunity for feedback, right? Because it's some kind of performance. I mean, it's some evidence of learning when they do anything. It's up to you guys to decide what kind of feedback does it give us. And right now, it's teachers just making those decisions independently, what kind of feedback they're getting and what they're doing a lot of testing for grades. I mean, teachers reported doing a lot of those things to take grades versus, to give them lots of feedback on, well, where are my kids at? What progress have they made? And that's not unusual, but it's, again, a lot of teachers don't necessarily connect. They think that grades or performance is ultimately the test versus all that other stuff that kids do all the time that sometimes is better evidence of their learning than just a test. And that's just, different understanding of, well, what is our evidence of learning? And that's actually having success criteria and evidence of learning is the next piece now of this standards wave that we're starting to think about. Well, this is the standard, what does it mean when they've met it? And that's the success criteria, and then we need evidence of learning. When do we see it? And so that's the new buzz in districts, defining that, getting clarity on that, getting that into the hands of teachers. So, but everybody is in that boat right now, right? I mean, I don't want you guys to feel like you're somehow behind the curve because you're not. You're ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, but this is just what a lot of districts are in the middle of grappling with right now. Is this, okay, success criteria, evidence of learning, what does this all mean with all these standards? And then you mentioned about your kids, because you have this big gap, you really don't know specifically where each child is at. Not at the level that I would want to see, particularly with reading and progress in reading, because that's such a huge one. Numeracy, literacy, we can't get away from how important those are. Your AP exam, I put this up here because this shows, since you've increased the numbers. So if you look, you had in 16-17, 384 kids take AP exams, but last year you had 608. That is a huge increase, huge increase. So your percentage, in terms of the percentage at or above national average, that's gone down a little bit, but I expect to see that percentage increase because this is early days. Your teachers are dealing with increased numbers, different kids. They've got to figure that out a little bit, right? And so I expect to see those percentages increasing over time. So even though that percentage has gone down, you've done a lot of really hard work getting more kids in those classes. All right, so Standard 5 is really, and there are only a couple findings here. This is their one on productivity. And our idea behind Standard 5 is that you're doing more with existing or diminishing resources. And basically, your budget, you're financially sound, but our feedback on this is that, yes, financially you're in really good shape. We would like to see a stronger connection between educational program and financial decision-making, if that makes sense. So how you're budgeting, allocating according to what do we want to do with our educational program, and really supporting that vision and your mission as a district, and how to do that explicitly. And then our next finding is the technology. You have a one-to-one environment, also a huge change, big financial commitment. We would like to see greater use of that resource. We did not see enough use or at that level where the kids are really using it in innovative ways, because it can just really lead to incredibly innovative practices, and we didn't see as much of that in classrooms as we would like to. So also not a surprise, we see that in a lot of districts, but and this is hard, right, because technology is just a tool, a very expensive tool, but it is just a tool. It's the skills and the learning that we want to see behind it. So now the recommendations, we have 7 recommendations. None of them, we don't tell you, adopt this program, buy this, purchase this. That's not what we do. This is the hard work. This is really the work that we want to see in school systems. There's no quick fix, no magic programs, no magic bullet. We give you a suggested timeline. We get asked to come in and do post audits, and I tell people we're not even going to come in less than 5 years, because this is the work. This is the everyday work. Change takes time. It's a lot of hard work. Your next tier of work to do, this is minimum 4 years to really see these things put in place, and even longer to really institutionalize them. So just keep that in mind. And I always tell people that with some of these things, the process is even more valuable than the product itself, right? So you'll see these themes: vision, mission. I am all about you guys having your vision of what you want classrooms to look like, and then the rest of the work is, okay, how do we make that a reality? And you're never fully there, right? But you're always making progress and working towards that. So we are big on keeping that vision central, that mission, and everything else is written and developed and trained to support it and to get closer at it. So we are big on policy, having plans, systems, consistent systems and structures, and clearly defined roles so that people are working in concert with one another. And then also the communication piece on all these things that we're putting in place. How are we communicating it to all the different stakeholders so that we're all on the same page? So the first recommendation is really about a plan for implementing the findings and addressing the findings of the audit, and how to move forward with the different recommendations. So this one, the first one, is really, dig deep into the recommendations, prioritize the work. That's something that Dr. Farrell or myself would be happy to talk more deeply with you about. But the work that we considered most important is the work on the curriculum piece, because with curriculum is also assessment. And I think putting a tool in teachers' hands that help them use those resources more effectively, and then training them in that, is the most critical piece. And that was our second recommendation. We always present recommendations in order of priority. So that work is the most urgent, the most important. And because of your size, you need to identify, okay, who's going to spearhead that at the central office, and how are we engaging teachers in that? Because teachers need to be a part of the process, but they also need to be trained, and are we pulling them out of, there's just a lot of logistical things for that too. So that's that curriculum management plan that kind of outlines, right, here's the process, here's, who's going to lead it, here's how we're going to involve people, and here's how long it's going to take, because that's really a 3 to 5 year trajectory on creating those tools for teachers. And that would also be developing assessments that go with that. And then our third one is your org structure. And since curriculum is the most important one, your org structure, really clearly defining, okay, who's going to be over curriculum, design, and delivery at the central office, and having total clarity about that is really important. And then having job descriptions that are up to date that reflect those responsibilities. And then the fourth one is about your plans, just revisiting plans, improving those a little bit, strengthening the connections and the congruence across plans, especially what's at campuses and what you have for a district long-range plan. I don't think you have any problem with your goals and your vision, because, that your Muskie way, that to me is strong. It's, making sure that your plan and everything is specific enough and clear enough to support it. So we're all about less is more, just so you know. And then our fifth recommendation is about assessment, and having a plan to guide your development of assessment. This really gets into how you're using your assessment data, what instruments you want, really thinking that through. So even though the curriculum development process, we have assessment development as part of that, this planning recommendation is about really thinking deeply about assessment in and of itself, and what we want that to look like and what we want it to tell us. And then our sixth recommendation is just addressing inequities. And with that, as a board, you all want to be thinking about, okay, what data do you want to be looking, do you want presented to you? What should you be requesting? having some kind of report annually that tells you, you know, how are different subpopulations doing in comparison to one another? Are we proportional with our GT enrollment? Are we proportional in our special ed program? That's very appropriate. So those steps under that recommendation outline some suggestions and also ways to improve the culturally responsive nature of teaching, because I talked about that cultural lens earlier. That's just something you're going to need to keep revisiting and think about for PD for your teachers. So that, because that really does make a huge impact on student learning. And then finally, just keeping in mind, and I think that you all as a group have been very mindful of this, that students with different needs require different supports. So leveling the playing field means that some kids need more at different times than other kids do, if we're going to level that playing field so that all kids can be successful. Our 7th one is on your budget. That link your budget decision-making more explicitly with your educational program priorities. And then our final one, that's it, sorry, just those 7. So budget was last. All right, any questions on this?
Holly, I'd like to say thank you, first of all. I think this is extremely insightful, and I think if every parent and community member could see this and we could make a plan for it, I think it would be fantastic for the district. You know, what I hear you saying is, you know, as a board and as administration, we need to do a better job identifying what we want the students to learn, how we expect them to learn that, and then really supporting the teachers who, what rang true with me was you said they're working harder than anyone right now, and we should have the students working harder. And I really think if we can help them with what we want each student to learn and what tools they have to learn it, I think that'll go a long way. So I really want to thank you for this. It's really insightful.
Thank you.
I just wanted to be able to, kind of along with what he says, is that I don't think that we are in a misstep, so to speak. It's more as in the clarity that we need. It's almost like we know there's those dots out there that's supposed to connect to it, and one brain may know this is what it needs to do, but the other brain doesn't necessarily know, and it's how do you make that communication,
Yes.
you know, work enough. But the challenge is going to be, I believe, because I understand from the structure standpoint when you indicate this is going to be something that's going to take a few years to get us to, is how do we make that structure in a way that along the way we have that proper communication, you know, going the right way and keep that in consistency.
Yeah, and I am glad that you said that, because I don't want anybody to feel like there have been any missteps, because I don't see anything in here as evidence of that. I think there have actually been a lot of really positive, good steps in the right direction. I don't think there's anything that I would say, oh, well, you shouldn't have done that, you know, 3 years ago. Really nothing. I think that now it's let's give greater clarity and refinement to what's there to better support teachers and make their job easier, and take some of what we expect teachers to do. And I was just having a conversation with a colleague about this. He said, well, that's lesson planning. I said, no, it's not. I mean, I want teachers to use their lesson planning to decide how they're going to differentiate for all the different needs in the classroom, but but the curriculum and the resources give them crystal clarity about what the learning needs to look like. And they can make decisions about what's best for their different kids or where their kids are at, because they know from the data, well, so-and-so is still struggling with this phonics skill. I'm going to pull a small group and we're going to work on that. But these kids don't need that. I don't need to teach all of them the same thing, because these 15 kids already have it. That's a challenge in and of itself for a teacher to manage groups like that. And so we have to make it easier for them to do that and give them those tools. So I think it's taking these things and refining it, helping them navigate them better, giving them that clarity. The standards are a great first step, but again, it's not enough. And we can't just rely on the teachers always, because that's, like I said, they are exhausted, and it's also a lot of pressure for them to feel, well, what if I'm putting the wrong priority on the wrong standards? What if I'm wrong? That's a lot of pressure on an individual teacher. We say that's the system's responsibility with teacher input, but let the system be the fall guy. Let the system take responsibility and accountability for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, go ahead, please,
I'm
please.
sorry. Yeah, I do agree. I mean, it is important for us as a school district, and you mentioned that too, to continue to celebrate our success story.
Yes.
As you mentioned, you know, even with the Muskie Way and so on, if we continue to concentrate on these points, that by itself is a success story. Is telling the story becomes very important, and assessing the outcome is the most important thing. I mean, I teach at a college, and we decided to move into totally a new assessment tool, and guess what? We are doing that over 4 years.
Oh, that's
so we
smart.
are on year 2 now.
Right.
So it's not something that's going to be magically changed by tomorrow, but it's very lengthy process.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that too, because I always tell people, don't, let's not require the sun, moon, and stars from teachers tomorrow, right? Phase things in, think about different ways to gradually implement some of these things so that people are, we're not overstressing, even with assessment tools, putting them in place over time so that teachers aren't, it doesn't have to be all at once. That's rarely ever good. Better to make small changes deeply. And we say for next steps, focus on this planning piece and how you're going to use this information. And like I said, we're available for any kind of support, and phone calls are free. You all have my cell phone number. But I also say here, just final thoughts, stay in schools as much as possible. I just think that really helps us stay in touch with why we're all here and what we care about, because when we go into classrooms, that's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's also the most really the most precious part about schools, right? And to recognize effort and recognize your teachers, because I don't think there's anything bad happening in Muscatine classrooms. I think there's a lot of really good things happening in your classrooms that really does need to be affirmed. And to note your progress, and to really, like you all said, celebrate those milestones, celebrate the things that you've done, celebrate the things that you've accomplished so far, because there are a lot of really good things. And that's what gives people, I think, that motivation to keep moving.
Holly, I think you've provided a great roadmap for the district, and I would agree with Erin. I think really insightful and hits a lot of points. And if there's one thing I guess I would add for the board as you move forward with this, is that at the heart of this is you're looking at paradigm shifts for central office, principals, teachers, students, and parents. And when you have that kind of second order change, I think it'd be really helpful for the board to have some time and maybe training.
Yes.
And what does that look like,
Right.
sound like in that process? Because that is what gets in the way of folks actually getting to school improvement, is stumbling over that part. So I think there's some great things in there. I think there's this district has a lot of things looking that will be positive moving forward. But I think if with Mr. Christopher and the board starting slow with looking at what does this look like,
Right.
and what are going to be some of the roadblocks, so that everybody knows what to expect as you go through the process, would be really helpful.
I think that's excellent, Jerry. And just so you all know, when I do training with people on curriculum planning and curriculum development, and where we always start is, what's your vision? You walk into any Muscatine classroom, what do you want? How do you want to see kids engaged? What do you want to see students doing? How do you want to see them learning? What does that look like to you? That's a great place to start, having that picture, but making sure that everybody shares the same picture. Because there can be great diversity in how people would define that. But that's really appropriate for you all in alignment with your goals and your Muskie way. What does that mean, right? And that's that tightly held piece. So, excellent.
Holly, thank you very much. And thank you to your team who committed a lot of time in the district as well in gathering information and may or may not have fielded a few phone calls from all of us as we work through
Always
this
happy
process.
to do that,
So
always.
we appreciate the efforts.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. It's been a real honor to serve you guys and anything we can do to help you moving forward. But we're excited for you. I'm very grateful to have been able to assist an Iowa district. It's been a long time since we've done an audit in Iowa, so that's really great. I am very thankful. And I'm also grateful because I think that you will have incredible capacity. So I'm excited to see what you can do over the next 5 years.
I think you'll hear from us again soon, is my hunch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jerry, did you have one more piece for us under board targets?
Yeah, just a real
goals?
quick update on, we're going with the middle school. We had three teachers that would not, three middle school teachers that would not be moving to Susan Clark, a media person, and two other teachers. They have been placed last week. They had a choice based on seniority of where they would like to be placed in the district. So everybody has their location now. And the good news, there were only three that aren't making the move, and because there wasn't a position for them. And they're continuing to work on scheduling and activities, and I think from my last report, I think a lot of teachers are getting just really excited to get this thing on the road.
Is the scheduling for the high school and middle schools that start, and typically it's like this next couple of weeks is when they take 5 days, and they're going right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jerry on the merger of the two buildings? Okay. The next item on our agenda is the action or possible action. The following items are considered to be routine by the Board of Education and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless the director so requests, in which event the item will be removed from the consent agenda and considered in its normal sequence from the agenda. Those items are minutes, employment recommendations, bills and claims, and special education contracts. What are the wishes of the board?
I move to accept the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to accept the consent agenda as presented. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 And opposed? And the motion carries. That takes us to item F, which is to set the public hearing for the purpose of certifying the FY21 budget, and that would be for Monday, April 6, 2020. At 7 p.m., we would be here at City Hall in council chambers. What are the wishes of the board on this topic?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to establish the public hearing for the purpose of certifying the FY21 budget for Monday, April 6, 2020 at 7 p.m. at City Hall here in council chambers. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 And opposed? And the motion carries. That takes us to our last action item, which is to award the contract to Wolf Construction, Inc. for the MHS Fine Arts renovation project in the amount of $224,295. And I'm going to guess that if anybody has questions, that Ryan is here to field those.
The good news with this is probably 200 and some thousand under what we had thought it might be. So it's nice to be significantly under budget on that. And these are to primarily increase spaces for the orchestra and some instrumental areas at the high school, that program has been growing and needs the additional space.
At this time, it doesn't have anything to do with the auditorium, the new lighting, or anything like that.
No.
Is there any chance that that's in the near future, just knowing, especially if, like the rest of us, I fielded a number of emails concerned that we were gonna be tearing down Central, which I said, I haven't heard anything about that, I don't think that's happening yet. But we don't know that if that building sells, I don't know what our plan would be with that. So is there any plan in
Well,
the
I think-
future about renovating the
what-
current high school?
What I think would probably make sense for the district is that the auditorium and theater would go with the building.
Right.
But with the understanding that we would have X number of years of use, which would allow to make sure it stands. Because that way it could be used for more public venues than and more, more activities than what it may currently be used for.
We utilize both right now, and just knowing that we can't control, I don't know that we have control of what would happen with Central, or,
Right.
somebody might, if we get offered the right price, we might sell for whatever, right? But in the future,
I
we
think if we-
probably need to look at the high school. I just know that
Yeah.
the lighting at the high school, and that was my primary concern, not
Okay,
so much
yeah.
Central as it.
Okay,
Are we
yes.
looking in the future about trying to upgrade the high school auditorium so that if we do have to have this, we're prepared for it? Because I know that it's not in this one, but I do know that the lighting system that's there is out of date, and the sound system probably needs to be updated, but,
I don't
when it
disagree
comes
with
to
you,
dollars.
and, I think the board did a great job in updating the seating, it's just, it is a really nice pairing. But I would agree that it's time that we put some of that in there, and I would recommend that not in this budget, but the next one, that you start looking at some of those things. And I thank you for bringing this up. I want to publicly say we have no plan, nor has there ever been a plan to tear down the theater. So,
Not in any discussion that we've had.
none. So,
Well, I would like to move to award the contract to Wealth Construction, Inc. for the MHS Fine Arts renovation project in the amount of $224,295.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to award the contract to Wolf Construction for the MHS Fine Arts renovation project. Is there any discussion?
I just have a question, Ryan. Is it, the construction anticipated to be finished by the first of the year, or will that be going
Start
on?
June 5th, and it's slated to be done between August 5th and August 9th.
Great.
yep. Good question.
Because this was all with those hallways and everything else to help with,
Yeah.
yes.
Yep.
Any other questions for Ryan? If there's no other discussion, all those in favor of awarding the contract to Wolf Construction for the MHS Fine Arts renovation project, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And those that are opposed? And the motion carries. That takes us to our discussion and information section of our meeting, and we have just some upcoming, I have some announcements on some upcoming meetings. So March 9th, where we are today through the 12th, will be parent-teacher conferences. March 10th, which is tomorrow, the Riverbend Mobile Food Pantry will be at the Administration Center at 4:30 p.m. is what time distribution, I believe, starts. And I haven't seen a sign-up sheet in the last few hours, but there were a lot of blank spaces. So if anybody has time to stop out between 4 and 6 p.m., your hands could certainly be used at 2900. Then March 12th, we have an early dismissal for parent-teacher conferences. That takes us to Friday, March 13th. There is no school, it's a conference comp day. And then next week, March 16th through the 20th is spring break, and there will be no school that particular week. That takes us right into April. And just a note that our regular session, our next board meeting will be April 6th, and this is the first Monday of the month versus our regular second Monday of the month. We'll be here at 7 p.m. Does anybody else have any other announcements for the good of the cause? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make the motion to adjourn.
And second?
Second.
Y'all like to leave me hanging on that second for adjourning. It's becoming a thing. All those in favor of adjourning, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? And the motion carries. Thank you all very much.
I didn't want to seem